Okay, thank you, Chris. Thank you, everyone, for coming. We are very happy to be here. So, uh, whence deep realism for Everettian quantum mechanics is if there is a deep realism, should be a shallow one, right? So let's start with the basics. Scientific realism comes in many shapes, colors, and flavors, but one thing that is common between all of them is the stance or the theory in, which tells us that scientific theories are in the truth business. They are true descriptions of the world in some sense of the in some sense of true. Okay, so but what is this that scientific theories tells us about the world? Uh, it seems that I cannot throw this equation, the Schrodinger equation, in front of you and say, oh, there it is. There is what the world looks like. At least if you're not some kind of shut up and calculate type of person, you must agree with me that, me and Jonas, that there is much room for interpretation. This is a very crude image of the world. So we need to interpret these equations. And this poses a methodological tension, because how far from science, from those equations, can we go in order to interpret them? This is where we meet the distinction between shallow and deep realism in the a pool pictorial representation given by Paul Magnus, Stephen French, and others. Here's the thing. In the shallow depth, you stick with science, and in the deep depth, you go beyond science in interpreting science. The thing is that the higher the depth, the higher the epistemic risk, because, you know, we take for granted that science has its own epistemic credentials, which philosophy necessarily doesn't share. So how far can we go in interpreting them? The first stance, which we call the naturalist metaphysics, stays in the shallow part. It was nicely characterized by naturalism, nicely characterized by David Wallace, who says that naturalism is the thesis that we have no better guide to metaphysics than the successful practice of science. So, for instance, if you want to know about metaphysics, well, you should pay attention to what science is telling us, because it wears its metaphysics on its sleeves. In the same vein, Tim Alden says that metaphysics is ontology, and this is we would like to highlight this equate, this identification between metaphysics and ontology by the naturalists such as Malden. He goes on and continue to say that evidence for what exists, at least in the physical world, is provided solely by empirical research. This is what we call an extractivist account of approach to metaphysics. It aims to extract the metaphysics of the physics, rid of the metaphysics of the physics. And doing that, they don't need to go beyond what science is telling us, because, you know, for the naturalist account, science gives us the metaphysics. So, but there is the ones who argue that we should go deeper than that. And for instance, there's the Viking or toolbox approach to metaphysics or metaphysics, given by Stephen French. He says that the Viking approach or the toolbox, which are basically the same with a different analogy, is to engage with extant metaphysics and draw on the tools it has already developed to help us understand what it is that science is telling us. So instead of reading off the metaphysics of of scientific theories, Stephen French tells us to go beyond that and to go to the history of philosophy, to the philosophical concepts and theories, and use them as tools that you can draw from the metaphysical toolbox in order to, you know, make sense of the scientific theories. This puts metaphysics in a very domesticated place in relation to science, but attributing it an instrumental value, and he was very criticized by that. But you know, his reply will say that, well, it is better to have instrumental value than not to having value at all, right? But here's the thing: the metric of this depthness is what he calls the Chakravarti's challenge, because Chakravarti once says that one cannot fully appreciate what it might mean to be a realist until one has a clear picture of what one is being invited to be a realist about. This clear picture is what we understand to be a metaphysical picture. So realists without the metaphysical picture end up in a position just like Jon Snow in the Game of Thrones TV show, knowing nothing about what they are being realist about. So this has dire consequences for the understanding of what scientific realism is, because Stephen French goes on in saying that those who reject any such need for this clear metaphysical picture are either closet empiricists or ersatz realists. Thus saying, you don't go deep enough in the metaphysical part, you are not realist enough. Shallow realists are not realists. Okay, this is a consequence. Our diagnosis of this methodological debate is to understand it with a bracketing of two disciplines in the same way that Massimiliano and Diederik just did. Me and Jonas and I are employing this distinction in various situations in the philosophy of science, and it seems to be a productive one. The same distinction is also made by Thomas in his Introduction to Metaphysics, by Thomas Hofweber, and many others, but it seems that it's by no means a standard one. So we understand the ontology to be individuated from metaphysics by their subject matter, or better yet, their tasks. Ontology deals with existence questions in these distinctions, whereas metaphysics deals with nature questions. So in our reconceptualization of this pool of metaphysics, Stephen French pool of metaphysics, the shallow depth will be the ontological part, and the deep depth, the metaphysical part. And this enables us to better appreciate what is being done by the naturalist metaphysics, because you know it seems that you can naturalize the ontological part, but not so much for the deep part. Let us discuss that briefly. So how about the worlds of Everettian quantum mechanics? In the present situation of quantum mechanics, I think everybody knows the now standard way to formulate the measurement problem, which is Mauldin's trilemma. Even though it is, many of you are not satisfied with this picture, we will not problematize it so far. We're just going with the flow and with the tradition of enunciating it, which is to say that the wave function as provided by a quantum mechanical description is either not everything, so you must supplement it with some hidden variables and you are a Bohmian, or it is not right, so you must give another dynamical equation or another dynamics, which is, for example, the collapse of the wave function. Then you are a G or a W, and so or it is everything, it is right, but what you see is not what you get. And if you see, for instance, a spin up in a measurement outcome, there must be a spin down elsewhere. And this is the Everettian solution to the measurement problem. We will go Everettian henceforth, so buckle up and put on your incredulous stares, because what Everettian quantum mechanics is telling us about reality. If we appreciate the ontology and metaphysics distinction, it seems that yes, the ontology can be naturalized in the sense that we can extract from science, from scientific theories, its ontological commitments, what it seeks as its according to the theory. So, in Everettian quantum mechanics, we will say, okay, there are tables and chairs, there are electrons, but what about many words, other words? Well, that's complicated. And let us bracket some set of questions here, because we will not address whether Everettian quantum mechanics is a consistent solution to the measurement problem, nor if it is the best one, but just focus on whether are there many words or not. And this is complicated because we have one-word interpretations of Everettian quantum mechanics due to Jeffrey Barrett, Christina Conroy, and supposedly Hugh Everett himself. But we also have the many words interpretations due to Bryce DeWitt, David Wallace, and most recently by Alistair Wilson. Just a quick note on that, this pictorial representation of many words is not quite right for the Alistair's picture, because his argues for the divergence account of words which would be better depicted as parallel universes instead of branching universes, which he calls the overlapping account of words. But this is a technicality that we won't discuss any further. So, are there many words? This seems to be an ontological dispute. We have Everettian actualists, such as Christina Conroy, saying that we need not to posit ontological extravaganza to make sense of Everettian quantum mechanics, because each description can be understood to be relative one to another. So the alive cat is alive in relation of its being dead. My coffee mug is on my desk in relation of me putting it there. You are watching this talk in relation of you registered it at our website, and so on and so forth. But quantum modal realists, such as Alistair Wilson, says that we need to, in fact, posit the existence of many words because of broader theoretical utility. You see, in his quantum modal realism, Alistair Wilson argues that if we want to make sense of the physical concept of probability, which is a major issue on Everettian quantum mechanics, and if you want to make sense of the metaphysical concept of modality, you need to posit, to embrace the existence of many worlds, just as real as this one. So each description will depict a different world. Okay, of course, seems to me to be pragmatical advantage of the quantum modal realism, but strictly speaking, this decision is still underdetermined by the theory itself. So it is a familiar dispute that we will have learned in the past century between David Lewis and Alvin Plantinga, but only now in their quantum versions. The quantum actualist catalog will not put many worlds in its catalog, and the ontologists will put many words in the catalog of quantum modal realism. So, where's the deep realism for Everettian quantum mechanics? We don't know, because as we individuated both disciplines, ontology and metaphysics, and reconceptualize it in the pool of metaphysics, the shallow part deals with ontology, and it seems to us that it's precisely with ontology that the quantum modal realism and the Everettian actualism debate is taking place, whether Everettian words are concrete and exist or are abstract and don't exist. What is the nature of their words? It remains unanswered. So what are we to do? Take it away, Jonas.
Good. Thank you, Raoni. So now I pick from there. So let us just summarize where we arrived at. We begin with this challenge, Chakravarti challenge, that is advanced as a kind of requirement for a legitimate version of scientific realism. So the claim is that if you want to be realist about something, you need to provide for a kind of deep description of the entities you are expected to be realist about. Otherwise, you won't be a legitimate realist. You'll be a kind of empiricist or something like that. And we then are using this challenge and using this Everettian picture, this discussion on the ontology of worlds in quantum mechanics, as a kind of test, as a kind of a kind of test for this challenge, whether the challenge is legitimate or not. So basically, as Raoni was explaining, what we arrived at with this help from the distinction between ontology and metaphysics is that those accepting Chakravarti's challenge, or at least those engaging with it, will require that in order for you to be realist, you must have your ontology and also a metaphysical layer over it. So that is the meaning of going deep. So going deep enough is not only having the ontology, but also the metaphysics over it. And what Raoni has just mentioned in his explanation of the different options on the many worlds in quantum mechanics is that the dispute between a single world or a lot of worlds is a dispute on the field of ontology. We just don't go deeper than that. We don't go for a metaphysics of possible worlds. There is still, at least, not a discussion on the nature of these worlds. So although this dispute appears in metaphysical contexts, it is a dispute on the catalog of reality. So at least for those accepting Chakravarti's challenge, we are on the part that we are not going deep enough. So the problem that we need to address now is what should we do with that? And our point is that in this context of the many words interpretation and this dispute about a single word or many words, we can basically use it to challenge the very challenge, to question the requirement of this needs to go deep in metaphysics in order to be realist. We are not defending that we should be realist about it, but we are using this discussion to challenge the very methodology of the approach to realism in the metaphysics of quantum mechanics. So the point that where Raoni left the discussion was we just have this ontological dispute. So what do we do now? We have two options basically. We just relax and say, okay, so I won't answer to Chakravarti's challenge, and being a shallow realist is good enough. Or maybe I should build the metaphysical tools in the toolbox of metaphysics for worlds. And so far, as far as I know, no one has done that in this case. But of course, and then the yeah, thank you.
Sorry.
And then the realists like Stephen French, the deep realists, would complain that this is not a legitimate version of realism. A first remark that I would like to do in this series of complaints that we have about the very challenge is that it seems that the challenge of the requirement by the challenge of going deep and adding a metaphysical layer over the ontology is a bit poorly motivated, because the claim is that we cannot just repeat the physics. We need some kind of understanding. And this was the topic also of Diderik and Massimiliano's talk previous 2 hours. And this came very nicely to suit our talk too. And the claim is that just by repeating the equations, we don't understand what we are doing with quantum mechanics. But the point is that given that the ontology if we are right in doing this, given that the ontology comes from an interpretation of the theory in this sense of interpretation that is advanced by the discussion in quantum mechanics, the interpretation is responsible for not only populating the world with further entities, in this case with new worlds, but also for giving a kind of picture of the world. So we do already have a kind of image of what the world looks like when we give the ontology. So to ask us to go deeper than that and also give a metaphysics in order to make this intelligible seems to be a little not completely motivated, because we already do have a kind of picture of the world when we still stop at the ontology level. So now I go to the next slide. Thank you. So this is the first kind of challenge for the challenge: how to motivate this need to go deeper, because basically the motivation is, well, the equations do not tell us too much, but when we go to ontology, we already have a similarly good story about what quantum mechanics tells us about the world. It's a very strange story, and sometimes it's not easy to understand it, but I'll come to this later in more details. The second problem is that if we want to go and be deep realists, then we'll be in another trouble, which Chakravarti has already raised. Chakravarti does not seem to accept Chakravarti's challenge. It was not his fault that Chakravarti's challenge is called Chakravarti's challenge. Stephen French has made it this kind of nice story, and then Chakravarti answered to it, and he said, well, it is simply not the case that every last question regarding the ontological natures of things must be settled in order for realism about them to be viable. So, of course, he's not using exactly the same terminology as ours, but he mentioned the ontological natures, and we mentioned the metaphysical nature, but or metaphysics as the area of philosophy that is responsible to deal with nature of things. So Chakravarti is just complaining that this requirement for realism is not really necessary, just as we were complaining too. And so Chakravarti said that when we start to asking further and further questions, then we have the problem that we may always have additional questions and want to go deeper and deeper, and there is no limit to it. So this puts a pressure on the deep realist on what is deep enough. So how deep is deep enough? So we have this very nice picture of going very deep or not so deep, and the point is how do we, where do we draw the line to say which place is going deep enough? So this is the second major challenge for deep realism. The first one, it is not clearly motivated. The second one, well, we have a problem with this vague border of where to go and how do we decide where is deep enough. And now we go to the next slide. Thank you, Raoni. Which is a kind of challenge that we think makes good sense in the context of this debate of the connection between metaphysics and quantum mechanics and metaphysics and science in general. Again, this is very much a methodological point, because basically this would, it seems to us, lead to a kind of modus tollens of the challenge or of the deep realists. Basically, the deep realists requires that science needs metaphysics to be intelligible. So this is the challenge, at least as French and others are understanding it. And these realistic versions of the Everettian quantum mechanics that Raoni was discussing, the actualism and realism, modal realism, they are not realist enough because they do not go deep enough. They stop at the ontology level. So if we accept the challenge, basically we say that these versions of quantum mechanics or this understanding of quantum mechanics are not clearly understandable, or they are not really versions of quantum mechanics one can be a realist about. So in this sense, they are not options for a realist. which is kind of very weird, to say the least, in the context of the debate. They are basically these people are closet empiricists or ersatz realists, which is a bit of saying too much about them. So in this sense, what results is that Chakravarti challenge is a challenge that places too stringent a demand on interpretations. It would like it to place this in very clearly realistic interpretations in the wrong place. So maybe this is a good place to say that this is a kind of modus tollens of the challenge. Modus tollens of the challenge. It is a challenge that is demanding too much, and not these versions of quantum mechanics that are going too shallow. So instead of accepting the challenge and judging these interpretations as realistically inadequate, we consider, like most people do, these interpretations as realistic enough and judge the challenge to be inadequate as a kind of demand on a legitimate version of realism. So these are the basic three major challenges. And in the conclusions, we have another take on it. So please, Raoni, the next. Yes, thank you. So basically, our conclusions, and this is a further point, is that if we want to be deep realists in this sense of accepting Chakravarti challenge and adding a further layer of metaphysical description over the ontology provided by an interpretation, we may end with a kind of domesticated view of science, basically because the metaphysics always comes from some previously available metaphysical concepts. So the toolbox of metaphysics in this understanding that we are dealing with is basically the kind of analytic metaphysics that comes from the common objects, the macroscopic objects, and we want to use it to discuss quantum mechanics. So there is this problem that deep realism, in this sense of using previously available metaphysics, may do exactly what Ladyman and Ross were complaining about metaphysics. So in this sense, maybe going deep is not interesting enough, at least in the context of this debate. Because in the context of this debate, the plan is that we need to have a kind of association of creative or positive association between metaphysics and science. So science needs to benefit somehow, metaphysics needs to benefit somehow from science. And if we already have the metaphysics there, then it is just inserted in the top of science, then it is a little bit of a problem to see how this metaphysics can benefit from science. So we end in a very difficult problem that raised a lot of problems some 10 or 15 years ago, and that is still in the literature, not completely satisfactorily solved. So maybe we suspected it is this demand that metaphysics has this extra layer, this going deep enough, going deeper, that will require justifying. So it is the challenge, the very formulation of the challenge and the demand that we add an extra layer that needs some further argument and some further justification. And then this is, of course, what we are not doing because we are complaining about the challenge. So the next slide. That's it. Thank you very much. We will be quite happy to listen to your questions.
Thank you so very much for this deeply interesting talk, and also very thought-provoking as well. So Otavio has raised his hand since the last talk, so I don't know if he's continuing. he keeps going.
Permanently.
All right.
Okay,
so, thanks a lot, Jonas and Raoni, for this great talk. So I have a couple of questions. One is, on the use within the modal quantum realism of utility considerations as a justification for positing the ontology. I'm worried that that's actually a bad reason to introduce an ontology, because we all know that utility considerations are not truth conducive, right? Newtonian physics has as much utility as you can hope for in any theory, right? It's unified, explanatory, expressive, and despite all of that, is false. So if there are concerns that utility considerations may not work in the sciences, why should we think that they work any better in metaphysics? So that's one concern. The other is, once again on the quantum model realism bit, I'm not sure exactly where to place if just positing worlds is shallow enough, or would already just bring in to the deeper end, just because you need to tell a story about what worlds are minimally, so you know what exactly is it that it's being posited. Fair enough, you may not say, as Anjan would say, you need not settle every single question that you may want to have about them, but some basic ones you need, right? What kinds of objects they are. Are they objects, right? You've been saying whether they're concrete and abstract, which is the point that you noted, already seems to me to categorize those things and their natures in the direction of the metaphysical deeper end, rather than the shallow part. Because that's the distinction between concrete and abstract is a pretty heavy-handed philosophical distinction. It's not something to be taken, I think, very lightly. Okay, but thanks. It was a really interesting.
Dirk and Marcelino, could you close your mic, because it's kind of, there is some noise. Thanks.
Thank you. So thank you, Otávio. Your second concern is just the moral of this story, because one might say, well, I'm okay with that. How deep one should go in the metaphysics? Well, this is up for grabs. You know, you may be satisfied with the concrete and abstract notion, but maybe Chris will not. This will not cut it for him. What is the criteria? How deep is deep enough is still up for grabs. And as for your first concern, it is also I also agree with that. It reminded me a chapter you wrote with Professor Newton on quasi-truth and interpretations of quantum mechanics, because the only thing you could do was to introduce pragmatical advantages, but they are not truth conducting. So I also agree with that. But on the other hand, as we cannot use these pragmatical features to evaluate one or another objectively, we have, on the other hand, we have the ontological determination. So there are still options. It is a still option to posit many words or to choose to not. But thank you for your...
May I just give a compliment of this answer?
Please.
Yes. Okay. I'll just add some words. Maybe I shouldn't. So thank you, Otávio, for the questions. As to the first one, yeah, indeed, it is a very difficult problem. But in our case, we are not really defending this interpretation. We are using it as a kind of counterpoint for the methodological discussion. So, of course, we totally agree that utility considerations are not really appropriate in the case of those that really want to defend this version of this interpretation of quantum mechanics. So we start from that. So in case we wanted to discuss this, we would have to go deeper into this kind of question. And on the second question, on, for instance, concerning certain questions that we have to answer about worlds, indeed, the point is that the idea of attributing to metaphysics a description of the nature of the entities, as Chakravarti did and as Stephen French does, and as we did, me and Raoni, a lot of times, is very vague, because when you ask what is the nature of something, the example that Stephen French gives is concerning quantum individuality. So basically, you have the ontology. The particles are objects, and what is the nature of these objects? Well, the nature concerns their individuality and their non-individuality. So in the case of words, we just don't have this further, even an example. So if I needed to give an example, so we have words, the words are the objects, and we need to ask about their nature. So what is their nature? So we don't have this kind of, even an example to say, well, they are individuals or non-individuals. This is not even a question that is typically made. So this is the problem indeed. But concerning abstract and concrete, maybe this is not going deeply metaphysical, because someone like Stephen French that accepts this kind of challenge will say, well, so we have, for instance, numbers. Numbers are abstract, and still there is a question, what are they? In metaphysical terms, what's their nature? So maybe the concrete and abstract distinction still could be made at the ontological level. So that's what I would say. So that's not going still very deeper, much deeper than ontology.
But how exactly this is done ontologically?
What this?
The distinction between the concrete and abstract?
Okay, but this is the distinction that is provided for in terms of typical terms of this distinction, in terms of occupying a place in space, a position in space and time. So there are many ways to do it, and many problems with each of these ways. So I just would say that I just would mean that categorizing objects into abstract or object or concrete is not already addressing the question of the nature of things in this more specific or special sense that seems to be required in metaphysics.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so my point was not to answer the question of how to categorize it, just to say that this categorization seems to be still at the ontological level. But okay. Thank you, Otávio. Thank you, Chris.
So now we have Tom for second question. Or did you have your...
Sorry, that was a mistake. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. So then I will make another question. Please feel free to, there is some time left, so if anyone wants to raise their hand, you're very welcome. Okay, so of course I kind of disagree with this discussion about realism. It's very unclear to me what realism ends up being, because at first you start with scientific realism. Okay, so scientific realism is about claiming that the theories talk about, you have to add an interpretation because that interpretation links to reality, and you believe that that interpretation is true. But now you're kind of adding layers on this discussion, on this debate, and I mean, you place the realist in a very weak spot, of course, because it's not even clear what realism is, because you kind of first claim that the need of addressing the picture of what reality is, and that would mean, I believe, that to explain what reality is in a certain sense. So if we start now discussing how deep has to this explanation needs to be, well, now you're relativizing the very presupposition of the realist, which is that you can make such an explanation, even though I don't agree with this definition of scientific realism, but just to take your standpoint. So my question is very simple. What's a realist?
Well, I don't. We seem to disagree with this picture that we have describe it. But in Stephen Freund's defense, I would say that what is being asked is, what are the options for the realists to what are the realist options or no?
I'm not sorry. I'm not asking about Stephen French. I'm asking about you.
Okay.
So, what is a realist for you? So what's the definition of being a realist? That's my question.
The realist is the one accepting that. Sorry, are you asking about realism per se, qua realism, or realism qua scientific realism? Just
yeah, what is to be a realist?
Realist about something.
You consider the only possibility scientific realism to be a realist, but so just in general.
You can be a metaphysical realist and claim that there is a outside world. You're a mathematical realist and say that there are numbers, a moral realists and scientific realists, so on and so forth. For me, realism is based on the defined on the kind of a belief you had about something, be it metaphysics, be it moral, be it mathematical or scientific.
So it's a subjective belief?
I would say so. What are your thoughts on this, Jonas?
Well, I would say that we are taking here realism to be a quite standard notion that one must take the theories describing at least approximately correctly how the world is, and in particular the posits, the entities that the theory is committed to. And if you believe that theory is correct, you are committed to accepting the existence of these entities. Of course, there is a lot of details that may go into it, but this is the very basic and general understanding of realism. So basically you are accepting, and we are not discussing whether we should accept Everettian quantum mechanics, but basically we are accepting that if someone accepts that one should adopt Everettian quantum mechanics, then one seems to be committed, for instance, at least to the existence of worlds. And these worlds may be of different natures depending on the version one accepts. And our point is that, according to the Chakravarti challenge and Stephen French and these people, this may not be enough for you to be a realist. So you need this metaphysical picture, which, as you just mentioned, you described it very nicely. The problem of what becomes of realism, after all, is that we just don't know what realism becomes.
Okay, thank you very much. There is another question by Dirk.
Okay, thank you, Chris.
Thank you for the very interesting talk. I have to reflect about a lot of things, but I have the following question. In your view on what you exposed in your talk now, where would you situate this idea of Einstein originally in the EPR paradox paper to introduce a kind of an operational element of realism, you know, what he called element of reality? Where would you situate that attempt to approach realism in an operational way?
Yes, that would be part of a kind of part on understanding the criteria that a realist may use to consider that the entities are indeed real. So basically, we may have different kind of ways to spell out how we get committed to entities and what are the criteria to be committed. So this Einstein criteria would be part of the details of how to spell out the commitments of one with the ontology. So the demands of what should be satisfied by something in order for us to be committed with this something.
Yes, I would add that if we are committed to this, how they put it, an element of reality, is that what we are saying, that we agree on its existence. So it is on the ontological part of this bracketing that we made between ontology and metaphysics.
Yeah, but because you talked about belief, but if you introduce this operational notion, it's not a question of belief. It's almost an experimental question.
Yes, sorry, Jonas, this is my fault. I think that realism can be better characterized as truth conditions, so to speak, are better adequate. In this sense, it will be objective. But insofar as we have many options, and insofar as this, if I accept that some description is a true description of the world, I seem to be justified to believe in what this theory is positing. It's not I'm not believing in electrons, for instance, because I want to, but because this theory is telling me that I ought to. In this sense, is related to belief, the realism.
Yeah, okay, I see.